illegal, and that's kind of scary at the moment.
What time are we going to start letting people in?
Well, they'll come directly onto the page. Okay, we're live.
Right. Now, Jim, do you want to keep your just keep the profile pic just to make sure, just as
we'll just play by ear. Okay, so hello everyone. I deeply apologize. We've had a series of technical issues. I might at some point need to cut out my video and allow my colleague Ben Bankhurst to run the meeting. I don't know if it's either just the amounts or the number rather of people on Facebook this evening or Zoom. But in any case, thank you very much for joining us. Again, I deeply apologize for the delay. That's my fault entirely. You get kind of complacent after months of things going successfully, and then the night when you're not feeling very well, the whole thing sort of tanks. So again, thank you. I already see our audience is growing exponentially. We deeply appreciate you all tuning in. Your time, of course, is deeply valuable, and we are extraordinarily glad to have you here. And like many programs, this is one in which I hope to actually learn as much as you all do this evening. And so tonight's topic will center on West Virginia across the antebellum, Civil War, and postbellum eras. And we'll specifically look at this issue of how statehood came into being. And as we'll talk about tonight, the legacy of West Virginia's past is a bit conflicted. There's a series of competing narratives that we'll explore, and I think it's an absolutely fascinating tale. And so I'm extremely excited to have our very esteemed guests this evening. And what I'll do is I'll go in alphabetical order, and I will start with my colleague, Dr. Ben Bankhurst. He is an assistant professor, but close to associate professor at Shepherd University. His research focuses on migration to the Appalachian frontier in the colonial and revolutionary periods. And he is the author of Ulster Presbyterians and the Scots-Irish Diaspora, 1750 to 1763. Beth White is a longtime friend of the Center, and she herself is an extremely talented historian of West Virginia in the Civil War era, as well as a scholar of Civil War memory. She is completing a second edition to her first book, which she co-authored, which discusses West Virginia's Gettysburg's monuments. And she is a graduate both of West Virginia State University and Syracuse University. And Eric is relatively new to me, but I think we met last fall. At this point during the pandemic, I can never do time, but
October 19th.
Okay, thank you. It felt like a couple months ago.
Yeah, unfortunately, it was October of 2019.
Okay, yeah, I don't know anything anymore about time. But he wears many hats. He is a historian, an author, a lecturer, a tour guide, and a battlefield preservationist of the American Civil War era. He is also, among other things, a practicing attorney in downtown Columbus, Ohio. So he wears many hats. He is also the author of many works. I won't go through the litany because there are many and they are all quite good, but most relevant for tonight is the book that he recently co-authored and published, Seceding from Secession, the Civil War, Politics, and the Creation of West Virginia. And so to our audience, welcome. I'm going to try to navigate my two computer screens here. That's why I'm looking all around and pose questions as they come up. And, you know, as always, your participation is greatly appreciated. But before we start into the program, I wanted to show, I think, three really fascinating statues. And that in some ways really speak volumes to the themes that we're going to discuss. The first of which, pictured before you, is Francis H. Pierpont, known as the father of West Virginia, though he himself never held a formal office, as we'll talk about. And this monument is located in Wheeling, West Virginia. So here's sort of one narrative of the state's creation. we have Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was born in Western Virginia, in a part of the state that became West Virginia. And we have here a statue, a rather jaunty statue of Jackson at Charleston, West Virginia. And then finally, and Beth informed me of this earlier, from 1921, we have the Union Soldiers and Sailors Monument, again located on the grounds of the Capitol here in Charleston, West Virginia, and it alludes to the 30,000+ West Virginians who ultimately are going to serve in the Union ranks. And so I wanted to kind of go through these three images, and then maybe I'll just turn it over to my panelists from here, but I think it gives us some sense. Let me get out of the screen here. It gives us some sense of, again, maybe a conflicted narrative about the state's formation and what it's chose to emphasize over time. And so before we get into maybe the bulk of some of Eric's presentation, does anyone want to comment on how West Virginia's origins have been remembered over time, and you know, how these competing statues sort of can inform us about the creation of the state?
I'm terribly fond of Theodore Lang's description of West Virginia as being the child of the storm. And I think it's an appropriate description. I think it really fits. It is in many ways indicative of the fact that the Civil War roiled West Virginia almost like no other state I can think of, with the possible exception of Missouri, where things were as evenly split as they were, and where there was as much combat as there was. In West Virginia, there was probably an equal amount in Missouri. They are similar in that sense. The difference, of course, being that there was no other secession movement that came to fruition anywhere else, although there was apparently, this is a recent thing I've discovered in doing some recent research, in Tennessee. There were apparently discussions about creating a Union state out of the eastern part of Tennessee that would secede from the state of Tennessee. So that these types of movements were more prominent than I think any of us ever realized. And I think that's what I find fascinating about it.
One thing that has contributed to the different narratives since the end of the Civil War, has been the fact that West Virginia, unlike a lot of other Southern states, had restored the right to vote for Confederate veterans within just 5 years of the end of the Civil War. They immediately retook the West Virginia state government. And so for 25 years, at the end of the 19th century, Confederate veterans were controlling the narrative in West Virginia. The other thing, and the Civil War Center has taken the lead with this and has been at the forefront of the effort over the last 30 years in looking at Union and Confederate soldiers. There's this idea that West Virginia was an overwhelmingly Union state. Yes, we produce generals on both sides. When you actually look at the common soldiers from West Virginia, we produced equal numbers of Union and Confederate soldiers. And those numbers have been verified thanks to the exceptional work that the Civil War Center has done. The other thing about West Virginia is you're looking at an area where there are no clear choices one way or the other. Even Wheeling, this hotbed of secession, produced the Schreiber Grays. And so you had situations where neighbors, even within one family, 3 brothers went north, 1 went south. And so that creates the conflicting narratives that we've seen as they both try to tell their stories.
Wonderful. I think, Ben, you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Sound issues today.
Yes. Yes, I just want to kind of jump on on something Beth had mentioned, and also Eric, when it comes to East Tennessee, I hope we'll discuss these sort of comparisons and kind of, I guess, the conception of sort of Appalachian unionism as a sort of perhaps a default in some areas, which is, I think, complicated. But to go back to those statues, I think, seeing them, one thing that a couple of questions come to my mind. Firstly, what are the sort of the national and local forces at play when determining the memory of the war in West Virginia over the course of time? I assume, for instance, with Jackson, and Jim, you were with me at that wonderful presentation that my predecessor John Staley gave on the Jackson monument in Clarksburg, in which that it was very clear that was an outside initiative coming from national groups who wanted to remember Jackson in a place that was so important to him, Clarksburg, right? So one question I would like to perhaps consider is the degree to which this history is manufactured by sources outside the state at some points. But secondly, I think, and this is again kind of stemming from something Beth said, it's often said that Great Britain only pretends to be small, and I think you could apply that to West Virginia as well, right? I think we need to qualify where we're talking about at specific points when we refer to the statehood movement and to popular sympathies over the course of time, because of course they vary not only within families, as Beth has said, but of course largely they're within the state, depending on sort of regional allegiances and connections with the East.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, and Ben, you'll appreciate this, we have a number of alumni and current students who are tuning in. So here it is, a Tuesday night in Shepherdstown and beyond, and they are just thirsting for West Virginia history. So thank you all, Josh, Chris, Alex, a number of you. So we deeply appreciate it. And to the overall crowd, again, thank you. I think some important points were raised. We'll probably get into deeper into the program, but at this stage, I think it would be useful to foreground our discussion in the antebellum era and sort of move into the Civil War period. And so what I'd like to do is turn it over to Eric, who will likewise do a screen share and cover some of these broader points for us. And so with that, the technology seems to be holding up here. I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome to my library in snowy, cold Columbus, Ohio. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So it's been an interesting winter here in Ohio, and I'm sure that everybody out there who's tuned in this evening is as desperate to get some semblance of normalcy in their lives back as we are here. So if we're able to break up your winter doldrums a little bit, then I think we've accomplished something good this evening. Welcome. So this is what Virginia looked like prior to its division in 1863. As you can see, the landmass was enormous. It stretched from the banks of the Atlantic Ocean, or the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the Ohio River. What's fascinating about it is that there are two really different sections of the state that are physically divided. You can almost see the dividing line in the map. If you look just left of center, you'll see there's more or less a straight line from Randolph County to Pocahontas County to Greenbrier County. And that straight line more or less represents the line of the Allegheny Mountains. The Allegheny Mountains served as a physical barrier to separate the people of the northwestern counties from the people of the eastern counties and the southern counties of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Let's keep in mind also that the cultural aspects are very different. The eastern part of the Commonwealth, largely English settlers, English descendants, tends to be flat or at best Piedmont areas. Because they are flat and Piedmont areas, it's a highly agricultural society. Lots of large plantations, lots of slaves working those plantations. The Tidewater region in the far eastern part of the state is where the concentration of the wealth was. You know, you look at some of the great plantations, like the plantation of King Carter, as an example, on the banks of the James River. And you see where this great concentration of wealth is. To the west of the mountains, you have much more difficult terrain. You don't have terrain that is necessarily as well suited to large-scale agricultural activities as you do in the east. Settlers in that area also tended to be more of Scots-Irish and later German descendants, and not a lot of English. So you have a very different cultural aspect. Mix in the fact that because it wasn't a highly agricultural society west of the Alleghenies, while you have some slaveholders, you don't have a lot. So you have a much greater reliance on slave labor in the eastern part of the state than you do in the northwestern part of the state. You have different routes of commerce. For the people of the eastern part of the state, the Potomac River, the James River, the Chesapeake Bay, the York River, even the Rappahannock to some extent. These are the major avenues of commerce. All that trade goes to the east. Whereas when you're west of the mountains, it goes to the Ohio River. It's important to note that Wheeling, which is in Marshall County, is 350 miles from Richmond. It is 60 miles from Pittsburgh. So shouldn't come as a big surprise that much of the commerce that was engaged in by the people of the northwestern counties was rather than with the people of the eastern part of the state, but rather Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, and Ohio. Why? It's a natural. The Ohio River is of the major route of commerce. So you have some real schisms in society. And those schisms really were accentuated within the new Virginia Constitution of 1850, which shifted the burden in large part of taxation from the slaveholders in the eastern part of the state to many of the smaller farmers and other business enterprises in the northwestern part of the state. It was to give a tax break for the large share slaveholders, and that in turn meant someone else had to pick up the slack. And if anything, that really started the snowball of secessionism in the northwestern counties rolling down the hill. In 1854, I believe it was, Daniel Webster, the great orator from Massachusetts, gave a lecture, gave a speech. And as part of his speech, he very accurately predicted that there would be a division between what is now West Virginia and the eastern counties, and that in fact this new state would be called West Virginia. So this process was already underway by 1860. It was really the Civil War and the secession crisis of 1861 that really served as the catalyst for the split that will take place between the northwestern counties and the Tidewater counties. John Letcher of Lexington, elected governor of Virginia in November of 1860, takes office in January. Letcher was an arch secessionist. Have to keep in mind that South Carolina, a couple other states had already seceded by the time Letcher took office, and Letcher was determined to lead the Commonwealth of Virginia out of the Union. Almost as soon as he takes office, he calls the Virginia legislature into session for the purpose of entertaining an ordinance of secession and to call a secession convention that will be held in Richmond during the early phases, the first quarter of the year 1861. And during the opening phases of this secession convention, in every county in the Commonwealth of Virginia, including those that make up West Virginia today, sent delegates. And during the opening phases of this convention, the prospect of secession was not going well. There was much more of a leaning toward remaining loyal to the Union in the opening phases. And really, that's why up until the shelling of Fort Sumter in early April, why the ordinance of secession hadn't been brought to the floor to a vote. But with the shelling of Fort Sumter, things changed. This is John Tyler, the 10th president of the United States, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, as it goes. One of the delegates to the secession convention was an ardent secessionist. I find it absolutely fascinating that a president of the United States, a man who had sworn to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States, was an ardent secessionist looking to lead the Commonwealth of Virginia out of the Union. Fascinates me. But Tyler was one of the loudest voices arguing for secession. But most of all, we have Henry Wise, who was Letcher's immediately predecessor, as the governor of Virginia. Wise had been the one to oversee the trial and hanging of John Brown. As you can see by the photograph, Wise ends up as a Confederate general officer once the war breaks out. But Wise was invited to speak to the assembled multitude, and he whipped them into a frenzy. He absolutely whipped them into a frenzy over this whole idea of Virginia seceding. He had on the table in front of him a loaded gun that he would wield from time to time. And he whipped the crowd into such a frenzy that the chair of the secession convention brought to the floor a vote. But before I get to that, I want to point out the fact that the delegates from the northwestern counties that today make up West Virginia were vehemently opposed to the idea of secession. They argued against it quite loudly, and they also made it known at the convention that not only were they not in favor of secession, but if the Commonwealth of Virginia elected to secede, they probably would not go with it. So this is setting the stage for the conflict that will take place. Well, when the ordinance of secession was brought to the floor and the results of the vote were announced, John Tyler was seen with tears of joy running down his face over the fact that the Commonwealth of Virginia was now going to secede from the Union. But for one thing, there had to be a referendum of the voters of Virginia to approve the ordinance of secession. And that referendum wouldn't take place until May of 1861. In the meantime, we have folks in the northwestern counties who are agitating towards secessionism. This is a photograph of Archibald Campbell, Arch everybody called him, taken later in life. In 1861, Arch Campbell was at the ripe old age of 24 years old, but he was already the editor and publisher of the Wheeling Intelligencer newspaper. And he used the Intelligencer as a bully pulpit. And we're fortunate because the entire run of the Wheeling Intelligencer during this period of time is not only available, it's been digitized, and you can go to the Library of Congress's website and take a look at whatever issues you want to take a look at. And you will find that Campbell was one of the leading voices supporting this idea of the northwestern counties of West Virginia, what became West Virginia, seceding from Virginia. And he whips his people into a frenzy as well. And a decision is made that they're going to hold a convention in Wheeling. That convention will be called in early May. It will meet at the Customs House, which you see depicted in this woodcut that ran in Harper's Weekly. That building still stands. You saw the photograph of the statue of Francis Pierpont Harrison, and you'll see another one later in my presentation. That building today is called West Virginia Independence Hall. And it is, if you're ever in Wheeling, it is well worth a visit. They have a nifty museum in there, and the original courthouse or courtroom that was up on the 3rd floor has been restored to its antebellum appearance. And you can go in there, and it's really well worth a visit. But be that as it may, this convention convenes in May. And there's a number of things that are going to be discussed. One of them is this idea of secession. This is John Carlyle. Carlyle was actually the earliest and loudest advocate for the secession of the northwestern counties to come to bear. And as early as the May 1st Wheeling Convention, Carlyle is arguing for secession, and in fact brought a motion to the floor of the first Wheeling Convention to consider and to secede. Well, it was ultimately, and that decision or that debate was joined by this man, Waitman Willie, who was from the Morgantown area, another one of the early advocates of statehood. They ultimately decided that it was premature to be having this discussion. Why was it premature? The referendum hadn't happened yet, and the secession of the Commonwealth of Virginia was not yet a sure thing. So even Carlisle eventually agreed that it was too early. So the decision was made that they would wait and see what was going to happen with the referendum, that if the ordinance of secession were passed by the voters of the Commonwealth of Virginia, that they would then convene a second convention in Wheeling to determine the next steps. So the first Wheeling convention ended and the referendum was held and the referendum passed. Interestingly enough, it failed overwhelmingly in the northwestern counties. So the vote was very consistent. So with that, Virginia seceded from the Union formally. And in June, the second Wheeling Convention was held. And the second Wheeling Convention accomplished a number of important things. First and foremost, it declared that the elected offices of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the treasurer, all of the members of the House of Representatives of the US but one, both United States senators from Virginia, had all abandoned their positions. They had all become traitors. They had all violated their oaths, and therefore they were declared to no longer have any force and effect and no longer to hold any offices in the state of, or the Commonwealth of Virginia. Instead, they declared the creation of something called the Restored Government of Virginia. They appointed this man, Francis Harrison Pierpont, a lawyer from Morgantown, as the governor of this Restored Government of Virginia, and declared him to be the governor for the entire Commonwealth. Now, never mind that Letcher had been elected in a free election. Never mind that the only people to ever elect Francis Harrison Pierpont were the delegates of the Wheeling Convention. So a few delegates from a few counties are declaring him now to be the governor of West Virginia. They are of Virginia, excuse me. They also appoint other people to the other offices, a lieutenant governor, an attorney general, who was a young man who wasn't even 30 years old, a treasurer. They eventually also appoint John Carlisle and Waitman Willie to become the United States senators from the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Lincoln government immediately recognized the legitimacy, such as it was, of the Restored Government of Virginia. So we now have that activity taking place. At the same time, a motion was brought to the floor that ultimately passed to secede and to create a new state. And that would have to be put to a referendum. And once that was put to a referendum, then they would have to create a constitution for the new state. And then they would apply for admission to the Union as the 35th state. Those things happened. There was a referendum. The referendum passed. They did create a constitution. And then the application was submitted to the United States Congress to admit the new state. Here's where the problem arises, my friends. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution provides, new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. Do you see the problem, my friends? Because you have the same people supposedly consenting to the creation of the new state on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, as are the same people who are representing and advocating the creation of the new state. This is a problem. Now, that's not to say that Article 4, Section 3 had not been invoked previously. In fact, there were 3 episodes in history where Article 4, Section 3 had been invoked. In 1791, the Commonwealth of Kentucky seceded from the Commonwealth of Virginia with the consent of the Virginia legislature. 1792, Vermont, with the consent of the state of New York, seceded from New York and became the 14th state of the Union. And finally, in 1820, Maine, with the consent of Massachusetts, seceded from Massachusetts and became the 24th state of the Union. So this had happened previously. There was precedent for it. But what was unprecedented was the fact that this was the same groups of people advocating on both sides of the transaction. Never happened before, never happened since. Very unique situation. Let's shift gears for a moment. This is John W. Garrett, the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a Marylander who was very loyal to the Union. John W. Garrett received the thanks of the Lincoln administration in 1864 for his brilliant work in accumulating and passing on intelligence about the invasion of Maryland by Jubal Early that took place in the summer of 1864. Garrett was an essential person to the Union cause, in large part because his railroad was the lifeline to the east. And here you can see on the map, what's been marked in red is the course of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's main trunk. It goes from Baltimore through Harper's Ferry to Cumberland, Maryland, to Grafton. It then cuts north, goes to Wheeling, crosses the Ohio River to Blair, Ohio, to Zanesville, to Newark, to Columbus, where I live, down to the north of Cincinnati and Hamilton, and then ultimately ended in the early days in Indianapolis. It was later extended all the way to Chicago. As you can see, in places, the B&O actually parallels the Potomac River. And it also means that it passes through a lot of heavily contested territory. Maryland, Virginia. Keeping the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad open, flowing, and accessible was absolutely essential to the Union cause, particularly in the Eastern Theater. It brought men and supplies, and it kept the routes open. So keeping that railroad open became an important task for the Union Army. And in fact, an entire 10,000-man division was eventually assigned the strict task of doing nothing but maintaining and keeping open and garrisoning the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Not surprisingly, it became known as the Railroad Division. It was commanded by a fellow named Brigadier General Benjamin Franklin Kelly, who maintained his headquarters in Martinsburg in what is today West Virginia. These are the two states of the far eastern, two counties of the far eastern panhandle of West Virginia, Jefferson and Berkeley counties. As you can see, Harper's Ferry is in the northeast corner of Jefferson County. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, of course, goes through there, right through Harper's Ferry. It more or less passes through on the way to Martinsburg on a straight line there that follows the road network from Martinsburg in Berkeley County. It then cuts north and heads to Wheeling. These two counties, which are for the most part to the east of the Allegheny Mountains, and if you look at the map, you see in the upper left-hand corner where it's marked Little North Mountain that passes through right there where it says Martinsburg. That is more or less the dividing line. The two counties were primarily to the east of the mountains. It meant they harbored secessionist sentiment. They voted in large numbers in favor of the secession of Virginia when the referendum was put to a vote in 1861. They're largely agricultural. There are lots of large farms and plantations. They have slaveholders. These people were not interested in leaving Virginia. At the same time, because of the importance of the railroad, and also because of the importance of the Valley Turnpike, which passes right through You can see it there going from Bunker Hill to Inwood on up to Martinsburg and passing north. These are essential routes of commerce. And because these are essential routes of commerce, these two counties are largely garrisoned by Union troops. In other words, they are occupied by Union troops. And when the ordinance of secession of the northwestern counties was voted on, Berkeley and Jefferson counties simply weren't permitted to vote. Their people were prohibited from voting. And they will end up being dragged into the new state of West Virginia involuntarily by virtue of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So it is fair to say, I think, that if there were no Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, there likewise would probably be no West Virginia. So let's keep that in mind. This is John Bingham. Now, the legislation has now gone before both houses of Congress. It's got to go past the House first. John Bingham represented the districts of the southeastern part of Ohio directly across the river from Wheeling. He is a radical Republican, as that term was used in those days, ardent abolitionist, strongly opposed to secession, one of the louder voices in favor of creating this new state. And Bingham adopted the argument that the cause of unionism in these northwestern states was the most important factor. This is Thaddeus Stevens, a lawyer from central Pennsylvania. Stevens was an extremely powerful member of the House of Representatives. He was the leader of the radical Republicans in the House. Those of you who saw Mr. Spielberg's Lincoln movie, this is the character that was portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones in the movie, quite effectively too, I might add. Thaddeus Stevens was, again, vehemently opposed to slavery, one of the most vocal abolitionists. And Stevens took an interesting approach to the whole question of the constitutionality of what was going on. Stevens took the approach that it didn't matter whether it was constitutional or not. The ends justified the means. And the ends were to add another free state to the Union. And that was all that mattered. And whether it was constitutional or not was a question that simply didn't matter to him. Well, after a great deal of debate, the House of Representatives finally passed the bill and it went to the Senate. And when it went to the Senate, it was the subject of a great deal more debate. This is Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner was, again, one of the leaders of the radical Republicans. He was probably the most ardent, loudest abolitionist in the United States Senate. He had been beaten nearly to death by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina on the floor of the Senate during the run-up to the Civil War, when tempers grew very heated over the question of abolition. Sumner was bound and determined that no more states ever would be admitted to the Union that were slaveholding states. As I mentioned, there were elements of slaveholders in what became West Virginia, and Sumner would not permit West Virginia to be admitted to the Union so long as it provided for slaves. So the legislation was tabled by the Senate until December 1st of 1862. So this allows time for a compromise to be reached. And the compromise is often referred to as the Willy Compromise, named for Senator Waitman Willy of Virginia, who brought the idea up of, well, what about if we create a situation where the slaves are gradually emancipated, and that once West Virginia joined the Union, any children born of slaves would immediately be free, never having been enslaved, and that there would be a regime to free the adult slaves gradually over a period of time. Now, interestingly enough, John Carlisle, who is also a United States Senator from Virginia, and who had been the loudest advocate for the secession of the Northwest counties, decided that this whole slavery issue was a can of worms that shouldn't be opened, and suddenly, without any real explanation, because he never left an explanation behind, switched 180 degrees from being the most ardent supporter of secession of all of the people in the northwestern counties to being vehemently and violently opposed to it. And he threw up every roadblock he could conceive of to prevent the legislation from passing. Procedural arguments, amendments, all these types of things, excuse me, everything to prevent the legislation from passing. And it took a long time. And eventually Sumner agreed to the Willy Compromise. It wasn't perfect for him, but the fact that it provided for the emancipation of slaves was good enough for him. He withdrew his objection, and in early December, the Senate also passed the legislation. Senator Orville Browning of Illinois, a Republican friend of Abraham Lincoln's, personally carried the bill from the Capitol to the White House and delivered it to Lincoln. Now, we all know that Abraham Lincoln was a fine lawyer in his own right. Lincoln was bothered by the constitutional issue concerning Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution. He was troubled enough by it that he decided to poll his cabinet officers. He sent a letter to each of them asking them to please provide them with their written opinions on two questions. Number one, was the legislation constitutional? And number two, was it politically expedient for him to sign it? Now, in those days, there were supposed to be 7 cabinet officers in the United States cabinet. However, Secretary of the Interior Caleb Smith had just resigned his seat as Secretary of the Interior to accept an appointment as a federal judge in Indianapolis. And his seat had not yet been filled. So when this debate takes place in December of 1862, there are only 6 cabinet officers. So if you ask the question, how do you think that Lincoln's cabinet voted? If I told you it was 3-3, would you be surprised? Lincoln was thoroughly disgusted by it. He was heard to say, why do I even have a cabinet? So let's briefly talk about who voted which way. Finding the legislation to be constitutional and to be expedient, we have Secretary of State William Seward of New York, who had nearly gotten the Republican nomination for president in 1856. Abolitionist, again, one of the radical Republicans. Seward found, in his opinion, the legislation to be acceptable. Salmon Portland Chase of Cincinnati, Ohio, the Secretary of the Treasury. Chase, again, was one of the leading abolitionists. Chase also was one of Lincoln's primary rivals. He envisioned himself as president of the United States. I'm sure some of you have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's excellent book, Team of Rivals. A lot of that book focuses on Chase, Seward, Stanton, trying to get them out of Lincoln's way by bringing them in rather than keeping them on the outside. Chase was a fussy guy. He often threatened to resign if he didn't get his way. That will eventually backfire on him. But Chase also found the legislation to be both constitutional and expedient. The third to vote, Edwin McMaster Stanton of Steubenville, Ohio, former Attorney General of the United States, one of the best known, best reputed trial lawyers in all of the United States of America. He'd served as the last Attorney General for the last 4 months of the Buchanan administration. He then became the second Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration when Simon Cameron resigned in the midst of a scandal. Stanton, interestingly enough, wrote the shortest opinion of any of them, the former Attorney General of the United States. Again, found the legislation to be constitutional. Opposed, wrong way. Opposed were Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, whom Lincoln referred to as Father Neptune. Father Neptune believed that the legislation was unconstitutional. Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General of the United States, one of the great power brokers in American politics at that time, also found the legislation to be unconstitutional. And most importantly, Edward Bates, the Attorney General of the United States. Bates had been telling anybody who would listen to him in loud, uncertain terms from the minute the legislation was introduced in the House of Representatives until it came to his desk that the legislation was unconstitutional and that it was not appropriate. And he said so to Lincoln in no uncertain terms. So there's your 3-3 vote. Lincoln's got to break the tie. And ultimately, the decision rested with him. As Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. So Lincoln, who was very talented as a lawyer himself, wrote his own opinion. And while his cabinet officers were working on their own opinions, Lincoln was getting worked by lobbyists. He was getting worked by Arch Campbell. He was getting worked by Waitman Willie. He was getting worked by Francis Harrison Pierpont, all of whom who were telling him in no uncertain terms that if he vetoed the legislation, it would end the cause of loyalism in the northwestern counties of Virginia, that they would then forever be under the yoke of the Confederacy. And Lincoln adopted Thaddeus Stevens's approach and ultimately determined that the ends justified the means. As he put it, if we have to have secession, I would rather have secession in favor of the Constitution than against it. And on December 31st, 1862, he signed the bill. Now, the legislation had the provision in it that said that now the Constitution of West Virginia had to be amended to reflect the Willy Compromise. And that once that was amended and once a referendum was held to approve the new Constitution, if that referendum passed, then 60 days later, West Virginia would join the Union as the 35th state. The Constitutional Convention was quickly convened in Wheeling. The Constitution was amended on April the 20th, 1863. Excuse me, that referendum was held. It passed by a large margin, with, of course, the counties of Berkeley and Jefferson not being permitted to vote. And the bill passed. So, or the referendum passed. So on June 20th, 1863, Arthur Borman was sworn in as the first governor of the state of West Virginia. All of a sudden, Francis Harrison Pierpont no longer has, excuse me, a place in Wheeling, because Wheeling is no longer part of Virginia. So Pierpont and his restored government will pack up their bags and establish their headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from Washington, D.C., in a part of Virginia that had always been controlled by the Union. And West Virginia joined the Union as its 35th state. There's more to the story, but we don't have time for that tonight. I will simply leave you with the thought that, and I thought there was another a photo in here, but there's not. But you saw the statue of Pierpont outside West Virginia Independence Hall. And it very specifically says on the pedestal to the monument that Pierpont is the father of West Virginia. And as Jim quite correctly pointed out, Pierpont never held an elected office in the state of West Virginia. But yet he's the one who has the monument. And just as a quick footnote, before I wrap this up, I will tell you that John Carlisle never did resign from his seat in the United States Senate until he was voted out of office. Carlisle insisted on not resigning. He insisted on continuing to be a roadblock. Despite constant demands for his resignation, he refused to do so. So that's one of the great ironies of the story of the creation of West Virginia, is that John Carlisle ultimately turned coat on his own idea. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over, and I'll be happy to answer some questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric. And again, thank you all for tuning in. Again, especially those of you connected to Shepherd, we appreciate your time, but we appreciate everyone's time greatly. So from here, Beth and Ben, I mean, I'll allow you all to maybe further flesh out some points that were raised, or take us down some entirely different rabbit holes, I guess. Like I said, I am learning as much as my, I guess, my audience this evening. So I'll turn it over to you both.
couple of things, and that Eric touched on. One was the economic history of Western Virginia. And as he noted, Western Virginia did not have the agricultural based economy that you saw in the Tidewater and Piedmont areas. What's not that well known is that as early as the first decade of the 19th century, flour mills in the Northern Panhandle were transporting thousands of pounds of milled flour to New Orleans. The economy for Western Virginia